Hello, everyone, and thank you, Dr. McEwen, for the invitation to speak. My name is Tomas Vanderkam. I am a psychology researcher here at UBC Psychology at the Reactions to Environmental Stress and Trauma Lab, or REST Lab. And one thing that I study is how people survive and even thrive while dealing with extreme and oppressive circumstances. Today, I want to share what Ukrainian survivors can teach us about resilience, about identity, and about how Ukraine is on a journey toward Europe that's not just political, but also psychological. Specifically, I'll share findings from my research analyzing over 350 Ukrainian survivor narratives over the course of 2 studies from 2 of the darkest chapters of Ukraine's past, the GULAG and the Holodomor. Specifically, what psychological factors support resilience in survivors of these traumas. And I'll connect these to the ongoing war and Ukraine's modern efforts toward integration with Europe and self-determination. Now, a little bit of background on both the Gulag and the Holodomor. During the bulk of the 20th century, the people of Ukraine and their unceded traditional ancestral territories, as we like to say at Canadian universities, were violently and brutally occupied by the Soviets, the communists. And with Soviet occupation came various culturally genocidal policies against Ukrainians. So essentially the attempted cultural erasure and colonization of Ukraine. These policies amounted to, essentially, no Ukrainian identity allowed. And by the way, this goal of Ukrainian cultural erasure is much like what modern day Russia has in mind. That hasn't gone away. But anyways, the punishment for identifying publicly as Ukrainian under Stalin was concentration camps, otherwise known as Gulag. The Holodomor was an engineered famine from 1932 to 33 perpetrated by Soviet Russia under Stalin. It was deliberately orchestrated to erase Ukrainian identity. It's been recognized by 35 countries as a genocide, and that includes Canada. And what happened was, over 4 million Ukrainians starved to death due to a process called dekulakization, which was a communist initiative to eliminate the so-called rich peasants, or kulaks, who were accused of hoarding wealth, but were in fact just successful Ukrainian farmers. So of course, dekulakization wasn't really about economic equality at all. It was ethnic cleansing, disguised by egalitarian communist rhetoric. But thanks to historical records, Ukrainian voices have survived. We have testimonials from those who lived through both the Gulag and the Holodomor. These are real first-hand accounts of survival and resilience. And what my research does is analyzes over 350 of these survivor narratives to investigate what psychological factors best support resilience in survivors of these traumas. And we'll see that in a minute. But here's the central question for today. What does it take, not militarily or politically, but psychologically, for a people to reclaim their autonomy after generations of repression? And how do the psychological factors that help us remain resilient under oppression also later support a nation's capacity to self-govern and self-define and thrive? Because nationhood isn't just about borders or treaties, it's also psychological. It's rooted in identity and purpose and the ability to hold meaning under threat. And so in my research with Ukrainian survivors, 3 factors stood out as being linked to psychological resilience, and I claim that these factors align not with the coercive legacy of Russian control, but with the democratic and pluralistic values of Europe. Now, very shortly, we will take a look at what my data actually show. We are entering the research part of the talk, but all the psychological phenomena we're going to talk about relate to this question of, is Ukraine psychologically aligned with Europe or with something else that's more Russian? So what my research does is using language-based psychological coding systems across 2 studies, one for the Gulag, one for the Holodomor. I scored these Ukrainian survivor narratives for 3 core resilience predictors. These are factors that in past research have been found to be important for resilience in extreme environments. And we'll get into more about each of these as we go, but briefly, for now, our first predictor is motivational. It's called motive imagery. This is linguistic content reflecting personal motives. Our second predictor is a cognitive variable. It's called integrative complexity. This is a state as opposed to trait measure of cognitive complexity, specifically cognitive complexity that allows us to consider and integrate 2 opposing perspectives, 2 or more opposing perspectives, into a single unified one. And lastly, cultural identity strength. This is simply verbal references to ethnicity, homeland, tradition, etc. This is how much cultural identity language proportionately showed up in the survivor narratives. And we wanted to find out, how do these three resilience predictors relate to these two resilience outcomes? So here's how we're operationalizing resilience. It's very straightforward. Low language relating to stress, high language relating to well-being. And in the interest of keeping it brief, I'll just say these are very nicely validated dictionaries, just like the ones on the previous slide, of language closely tied to these psychological variables. You would be surprised just how accurate and effective this sort of linguistic analysis type of approach can be. And just to tell you about these linguistic analysis methods in a little bit more detail, it's only one slide, I promise. How did we actually analyze these interviews? We used a quantitative form of what's called thematic content analysis. We analyzed the content of the interviews for their themes. Thematic content analysis. And so what that means is we used programs with these specialized dictionaries to quantify in text, so with word counts mostly, how our resilience predictors are associated with our resilience outcomes. And so what that means is we scored quantitatively with these programs, and then we ran linear correlations in R. So who are these survivors in our two studies? How did they get interviewed? Well, after the Soviet Union fell in 1991, many survivors of Gulag camps were interviewed by mostly human rights organizations. And our first study takes 95 of these survivor interviews, totaling about 12,000 paragraphs or 1 million words, and analyzes their content to extract psychological insights about what factors are linked to resilience despite such negative experiences in the Gulag. These interviews were with individuals who were pro-Ukraine in the 1960s, imprisoned for their identity in the 1970s, and released around the 1980s, eventually granting interviews between approximately 1995 and 2015 with the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group and the Center for Research on the Ukrainian Liberation Movement. That was study one. In study two, we analyzed narratives from 268 Ukrainians who survived the Holodomor and who between 1989 and about 2009 submitted testimonies and letters to various journalists, mostly, which were then assembled into a collection by the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center. In total, we analyzed 1,900 paragraphs of Holodomor survivor testimony, totaling around 154,000 words. And I'm focused on all of these interviews, not so much as historical records, but as psychological data, right? By examining how survivors describe their experiences, we want to understand what factors make some people more resilient to trauma. So again, what my research asks specifically is, how do these three resilience predictors relate to these two resilience outcomes? And here's what we found. Now, like I promised, as we go along, I'll be telling you a little bit more detail about each variable. For simplicity, though, I will only be showing significant results with only one exception. There is a QR code linking a full paper at the end if you want to read more. But without further ado, here is what we know about, firstly, motive imagery. So this predictor is, of course, motivational. This, again, refers to linguistic content reflecting personal motives. I told you that already. What I haven't told you yet is there are three universal personal motives, and we all have these to some extent. They are achievement motive, that's accomplishing goals, affiliation motive, that's forming positive relationships, and power motive, that's having impact and influence. And motives are important because they will shape how individuals respond to adversity, and so that's why we're looking at them. And among these three coded motives in both Gulag and Holodomor survivors, achievement motive emerged as a prominent correlate of resilience, reflecting what we think is a persistent protective effect of this drive to overcome and build and act with purpose, even under repression. And so in both survivor populations, we saw tight correlations between achievement motive and this well-being facet of resilience. In other words, this finding replicates across both survivor populations. This is one of the most robust and largest in magnitude and most significant findings of mine so far, this association between achievement motive and the well-being facet of resilience, which shows up in both populations, but is particularly strong in Gulag survivors, you can see here on the right. Now onto our cognitive variable, integrative complexity. This is, again, a state as opposed to trait measure of cognitive complexity. And I've told you that already. But what I haven't told you yet is it breaks down into these two parts. The first is differentiation. This is the degree to which one's thinking acknowledges multiple perspectives. And integration, the degree to which one's thinking reconciles or integrates those perspectives. And integrative complexity is important because it's been found to be a key predictor of psychological adaptation in extreme environments in the past. So that's why we're looking at it. So does integrative complexity play a role in survivor resilience? Well, in Holodomor survivors, we found no relationship. However, in GULAG survivors, we found this small, non-significant correlation between integrative complexity and the well-being facet of resilience. So at the trend level, we're seeing maybe a relationship just barely poking its head out. The thing is, this direction of relationship, if it were significant particularly, that tends to be what is reflected in the survivor literature in general. So I'm not interested in totally discounting this because it doesn't meet a quantitative threshold. This is really a more research is needed moment, right? Is there a true effect there, or are we measuring noise? Finally, our social and cultural variable, cultural identity. This is just language expressing individual and social identification, plus references to traditions, heritage, ethnicity, homeland, etc. And of course, this is relevant because that's what's under attack. And so, is stronger cultural identity linked to resilience? Well, what we found was cultural identity strength correlated significantly with lower stress in both survivor populations. So 2 studies in a row now, we've found a significant relationship between cultural identity and this lower stress facet of resilience. So again, this is a finding that replicates. So what we think this could highlight, or at least what this would be consistent with, is a protective effect of cultural identity on stress, at least in a survival context. And so those are my results. Just to summarize, achievement motive was related to higher well-being in both GULAG and Holodomor survivors. Integrative complexity may be related to well-being. We cannot say from these particular data and these particular tests that we ran. And cultural identity was related to lower stress in both GULAG and Holodomor survivors. So what do these results have to do with Europe? We're now exiting the research part of the talk and getting back to the themes of today. Well, what it all has to do with Europe is these same 3 traits that support resilience also support self-determination. Achievement motive is the drive to build and improve and move toward a better future. Integrative complexity is the cognitive openness needed to engage in pluralistic, democratic dialogue. And cultural identity is the ability to uphold who you are, your language, your history, your values, even under threat. And all of these are visible in Ukraine today. But it's not new. This is a continuation of something that's been there all along. And we know that because we can measure it at each point in history. Now ask yourselves, where are these psychological factors that support resilience more likely to thrive? In a society embracing pluralism and individual rights and democratic debate, like the European project, or under an imperial model rooted in domination and forced assimilation, like the Russian tradition. So this war is not just about territory. It's about which psychological world Ukrainians will get to inhabit, one of dignity and self-authorship, or one of coercion and erasure. So where do we go from here? The first thing I can think of is, how can findings like these inform treatment protocols for survivors of Russia's current invasion of Ukraine? And if there really is a protective effect there of cultural identity, how can we harness that to boost resilience? And how different is that from something like nationalism? That's a really interesting question to me. And finally, how can survivor narratives reshape how we teach and witness Eastern European history? Can we expand curricula to not only show what was lost, but to center that inner strength that endures? In Ukraine's case, this is a people who have survived genocide, occupation, censorship, attempted cultural erasure, and who are now fighting not just for land, but for self-determination. And that's certainly not just political. It's very psychological. And given that it's unfolding right now, during our lifetimes, it's also something that we are called to witness. But I think I'll leave it there and open it up for questions. Thank you all very much. Ray.
I have a question about the collection of the narratives.
Mm-hmm.
I saw that they were in paragraph form, so written responses. Did you see any effect on the prompts that were used or the media, whether it be transcribed or written down, that might impact how the story is told?
Oh, that's a great question. So there were no prompts, or at least very minimal prompts. These were really, really interesting interviews. Some of them were like 3 or 4 hours long. They were done on cassette tapes was the technology that was used. And sometimes there's side A, side B. They stop to have a drink of tea and go to the washroom. And so very, very extensive interviews where basically the interviewer comes usually to the person's house and sits down with them and pretty much just says, well, tell me about your experience. And they just, like I say, it can be 2, 3, 4 hours sometimes. They have a lot to say.
In terms of, I guess like a follow-up on that, was the identity of the interviewer lying or like as objective unbiased to people? Like, do you think it might have had an influence given that they were talking about identity?
Yeah, it could have. The interviewers, there were, for all of these interviews, I think there was like maybe 3 people who conducted all of the interviews, all like 200 and some, 300 and some. So yeah, that could have played a role. Mostly the people who were collecting these, like I mentioned, were humanitarian organizations and research organizations. So they certainly took precautions to be as unbiased and objective as possible. But yeah, certainly that effect could have been introduced. Yeah. All right.
Thank you, Tom. It's fascinating. Let us all say
Thank you, guys.